Hi.
Hey,
Hi, welcome.
good evening from Toronto.
Hello from somewhere in New York State. I'm not going to reveal my secret location. My name is Erin,
And my name is Amar.
and welcome to the very first episode of Das Criminal Podcast.
Applause, applause. I'm doing applause.
Should we just say really quickly why we decided to make another true crime podcast when there's so many and why it's a little bit different than maybe what you've heard before?
Because we're quarantined and we're losing our minds. I mean, a lot of true crime podcasts, I think, do this thing where they tackle crime without questioning why some things are crime and why some things aren't, or like why some people are prosecuted for some crimes and why some people aren't, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And I think some crimes that have an intensely political element, not all of them, but many of these podcasts shy away from that. And we don't want to shy away from that. We want to look at that head on.
Yeah, we're not going to take for granted that what the state says is a crime is just like by default a crime. Like there's going to be a lot of questioning of the things that are considered crimes.
Right. We're always critical and we're always developing our own opinions when we're looking at these things. Like there are some issues that I have ideas about, but to be honest, even I need to become more educated in before saying, what I think about this in the world.
Yeah, it's a very unique, sort of a very rare specimen, a sort of a self-reflecting leftist. You don't see much of those in the wild.
But today's case, I definitely think there's a crime involved.
Yes.
And maybe not the way you think it's going to be, but I think we're ready to talk about it.
Without further ado, go ahead.
In November of 2018, 26-year-old American man John Allen Chau voyaged to North Sentinel Island, an extremely isolated part of India's Andaman archipelago. John was on a mission to bring the news of Jesus Christ to the islanders, a small group of people known to us as the Sentinelese. He illegally approached the island 3 times. On the first and second occasions, the inhabitants turned John away.
Turned away is a very nice way of saying they chucked spears at him and fired arrows until he fled. Like not to be rude, but like if I show up at a house party and someone fires arrows at me, I will take the message that I'm not particularly welcome there. I don't understand why he had to do it 3 fucking times.
Exactly. Not heeding these warnings, John advanced on the island once again. This time, the Sentinelese defended their land with lethal force. As they had done to intruders before, the indigenous people launched arrows at John, killing him. The young man died on the North Sentinel sand.
John Chow's haphazard adventure sparked conversations about the principles of self-proclaimed missionaries and the sovereignty of the world's most isolated peoples, or uncontacted tribes, as they're sometimes called. Was John a faithful Christian devoted to spreading God's love? Or was he, as one Reddit user writes, a man chock full of foreign diseases trying to kill an entire island via pestilence in the name of religious fanaticism?
As we move through this episode together, you'll find we both lean toward the latter. But in order to explain this position, we'll have to untangle John's thought process and analyze it alongside the doctrines of historical and contemporary Christian missionaries. Who was John Chau? Why was he determined to proselytize the Sentinelese? And why did the story unfold this way? Why is it important to the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights?
Well, first thing first, let's introduce the intrepid hero of the story to some. John Allen Chau was born in the early 1990s to a psychiatrist father and attorney mother, and spent most of his early life in Washington state. His dad, Patrick Chau, was born in Guangzhou, China in 1952, but secured passage to the United States during Mao's Cultural Revolution. Patrick eventually earned a medical degree from Oklahoma's Oral Roberts University, where he met his wife, Linda Adams, and where their son John would later study.
Oral Roberts is one of the many private evangelical colleges and universities in the United States. It was founded in 1965 by American televangelist Oral Roberts, and not to sound crass, but who names their child Oral? Especially a good Christian family such as this one. I checked, and Oral derives from the Latin oris, meaning golden, but it is literally spelled Oral. Could you imagine carrying a baby for 9 months, squeezing it out of your body, and holding it in your arms for the first time and being like, I'm going to call you Oral? I'm sorry, but I just don't get it.
It's quite ironic considering his dad was a Pentecostal preacher.
Yeah, they were pretty extreme, as we'll go on to see.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Pentecostals are the ones that like they hear voices or they sort of like run around like speaking in tongues and shit like that, right?
I was talking to my dad about this, and he knew someone in his past who would speak in tongues, and she was not Pentecostal. She was Catholic, actually. And I asked my dad where she went to church, and he goes, "Oh, she didn't go to church."
But see, that's weird because like the line between psychiatric disorder and religious fanaticism is basically like just a blurry mess.
Yeah, I mean, as we'll go on to see, but uh, Oral Roberts University as an institution, most of its students and faculty subscribe to evangelical Christianity. Evangelicalism is a trans-denominational Protestant movement. And of course, not every evangelical Christian holds the exact same beliefs. We're not trying to say that. But since John Chau's faith was a crucial element to his demise, we have to take a look at what his ideas most likely were.
The core of evangelical Christianity involves its interpretation of salvation. While all Christian sects recognize the significance of Jesus of Nazareth, evangelicals believe that salvation can only be achieved through faith in Jesus' atonement.
I wasn't raised evangelical, but I did grow up in an area with a lot of evangelicals and a few evangelical megachurches, so this culture isn't totally alien to me. I remember in one instance, our neighbors invited us to see a play at their church, and they didn't realize it was going to be actual nightmare fuel. I did some digging, and I'm reasonably certain that this play is called Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. It's basically an anthology of stories where people die unexpectedly, and those who have accepted Jesus as their savior get to go to heaven, while the non believers are literally dragged to hell by demons, kicking and screaming. You can find it on YouTube, and I guarantee you are not prepared for how awful it is. Also, and I'm just being honest here, it really lacks the dramatic composition and classic literary allusions of religious thematic works like Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. Catholics are thus far the aesthetic leaders in the realm of Christian propaganda.
I mean, it's generally speaking, monotheism and monotheistic art is very sanctimonious. Like it's a kind of opposition to Greek mythology. Like at least there, or even other mythologies like Hindu or Buddhism and so on. Like at least there, it doesn't matter your sort of moral fiber. In Greek mythology, for example, everyone just ends up in Hades, which is this like eternal purgatory. It's gray, it's like bland, it's blurry, but everyone ends up there regardless of what you did. Like this whole like drag to hell where you suffer fire and brimstone and torture forever by these demons. It's kind of very horrifying and actually psychologically questionable at best.
Right, I think that's kind of the point of it. I mean, needless to say, the other children and I watching this play were freaked out at the beginning. So my dad took us to the megachurch's childcare center and assumed that we would like just sit there and color. I was 5 or 6 years old, so I don't remember the exact details of this, but my parents have like retold it to me. And apparently, some other kids wanted to come into the childcare center, but they were unaccompanied, and the caretakers would not allow them in unless they accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior.
Okay, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but wouldn't like from a theological perspective, wouldn't the kids be too young? Like from my understand, like I was raised Muslim, so my understanding in Islam at least, you're only considered responsible for your own faith when you hit puberty. Before that, like you're born Muslim, yes, but you're not expected to pray or fast or whatever until you hit puberty. And I understand it's the same with like Jewish religion in terms of like bar mitzvahs and Catholic confirmations. Like surely from a theological perspective, these kids had no responsibility to accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior.
Yeah, I don't think young children can understand the concept of salvation, generally speaking.
But even from like the evangelical church's perspective, how do they justify that kids will understand like accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior?
Indoctrination. in one
Like,
word.
I mean, that's depressing.
Um, by the time my parents came back for us at this childcare center, I was in tears and pleading with the caretakers to let the other kids in because they were outside and scared. And I did not understand why they couldn't come in. I mean, who lets children cry outside a daycare center because they haven't accepted Jesus? How is that Christ like by any interpretation? And my parents, being normal people, were like, what the fuck? And even the neighbors who brought us there were super apologetic because they had no idea how cruel this was going to be.
But surely they would have like somewhat expected it. Like if they've gone to this church for a while, they must know that like only kids who accept Jesus Christ will be allowed into like the child pen or whatever it's called.
I think they stopped going after this.
That's right. At least one family saw how fucking psychotic that was.
Yeah, I think they were kind of new at this church too. I could be misremembering, but after that traumatizing ordeal, I had nightmares for a really long time where Satan was coming to get me or my friends and drag us into a fiery pit. And my mom had to be like, Satan is not real. He's not coming to get you. That play was made up to scare people, but it was really intense.
What did Satan look like in your dreams?
I think the figure now that we know as the devil, which has been totally like twisted from the biblical devil, who was like hot. Like OG Satan was fucking hot.
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Oh, he was an angel.
right. But like,
Yeah.
was he like? Did he have like appearance like a human, or was it like
No, he was
completely different?
like the scary goat man.
Right.
Like the pagan Satan that we've all now come to know and fear.
The one from all those horror movies.
Right.
Yeah. There's actually, I don't know if I should go on a tangent here, but the origins of that imagery are actually really interesting.
I know the ties between Satan and Jews in Europe. Like Satan was consistently used as a figure to demonize Jewish people by Christians.
Yes, but there's also another background to that. You know the image of Satan with like the goat's head and like the goat's head on a human body with like cross-legged with like the pentagram. Um,
Baphomet.
Yes. So Baphomet came from the sort of when the Franks sort of did the Crusades and they went to the Middle East and they got it like they came into contact with Muslims. The French translation of the name Muhammad was Mahomet, and part of Crusader propaganda at the time was calling Muslims Mohammedans or Mahometans, which are like people who worship Muhammad. Like they didn't believe that we had a god; they believed that we were worshiping Muhammad. And eventually Mahomet became Baphomet, and part of the propaganda was portraying the Prophet Muhammad as this like person with a goat's head and like the avatar of Satan, to sort of encourage like crusader like zeal. And so as that sort of propaganda made its way west towards Europe, it sort of became the Baphomet we know today, with like the Satan and so on and so forth.
Right. That's so interesting.
It's just really interesting seeing the Baphomet in horror movies and being like, "Yep, that's Muhammad. That's the Prophet Muhammad." Anyways, historian David Bebbington notes four critical features of the evangelical faith. The first of these is conversionism, or the necessity of being born again. Unlike Catholics, for instance, who are typically baptized shortly after birth, evangelicals must personally accept the doctrine of salvation, and many are baptized multiple times throughout their teen and adult lives.
The second feature is biblicalism, which means that evangelicals take the word of the Bible very seriously. The most rigid evangelicals read the Bible very literally. These are the people who sincerely believe in creationism as fact and await the rapture as described in the book of Revelations.
Just a side note here, the Venn diagram of American evangelicals and supporters of Israel in the American polity is basically a circle within a larger circle, because evangelicals believe that the return of the Jewish diaspora to the biblical lands of Judea and Samaria is a prerequisite to the literal apocalypse. And being a death cult, not only do they believe that is should happen, they believe it's their responsibility to bring this about. And the irony here is that they believe that once all the Jews go back to Israel, then everyone gets turned to a pillar of salt and you get hoovered up. And then I think it's like a third of Jews are considered like unsavable and they die or something, and the other two-thirds convert to Christianity, accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and get hoovered up with the Christians to like live in heaven or whatever. It's actually really like, quite surreal even by evangelical standards.
Right. Deeply, deeply anti Semitic.
Yeah.
And actually, our subject today, John Chau, if you go on his Instagram, which I did, it's at John Chau,
Is
he
this still up?
posted,
Jesus.
oh, it's still up. He posted in 2015 in occupied Palestine, like hashtag Israel, hashtag Armageddon, hashtag rapture.
Hell yes! Oh hell yes! Yeah, no, but honestly, like these people, like they would look like a Jew in the eye, and they'll be like, "Yes, I support your right to go to Israel, so you could either die there or convert to evangelical Christianity when we all turn into pillars of salt." Like that's fucked up.
That's his whole attitude, as we'll discuss throughout this episode. It's not surprising at all.
Yeah, these people like genuinely like there's a lot there to unpack.
The third aspect of evangelicalism is crucicentrism, which essentially explains that evangelical Christians believe Jesus was crucified to atone for the sins of humanity. In the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, the crucifixion and resurrection are the most important things. Finally, evangelicals engage in activism. For some, this means missionary work. For others, it means injecting politics with their religious beliefs. Evangelicals are a huge and also very reliable voting bloc in the United States, and most, though not all, lean conservative and typically vote for Republican candidates.
Yeah, thank Nixon and Reagan for that.
As much as we might want to believe that religion is a personal matter of faith and spirituality, political circumstances have always influenced how people construct their religious identities and define their communities as distinct from other theological collectives. Christianity itself didn't coalesce as a religion separate from Judaism until about 200 years after the death of Jesus of Nazareth. Religion has often served as a proxy for political disputes and a justification for colonialism, from Europe's takeover of the Americas to Israel's settlements in Palestine. At Oral Roberts University, the school's interpretation of Christianity is very much intertwined with student life. Students under the age of 25 must live in the university's dormitories, which are divided by sex. Men's access to women's dormitories is extremely restricted, and vice versa. Attendance at weekly chapel services is mandatory. Students must also sign a code of conduct that prohibits, quote, lying, cursing, smoking, drinking, and a range of sexual acts, including homosexual behavior and sex outside marriage, end quote.
Check, 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 check. If I was at that university, I would absolutely have been expelled 2 days into Frosh Week for pretty much all of the above.
Oh, it sounds horrible. The university also has a proselytizing mission. According to Alex Perry, writing for Outside Online magazine, Oral Roberts claims God told him to send students, quote, even to the uttermost bounds of the earth, end quote. In 1997, ORU students in Tulsa disrupted a Ramadan service at a nearby mosque to pray for the conversion of the Muslims there.
Jesus Christ. Well, this is the environment from which John Chau emerged. In addition to being a devout evangelical, he was an adventurer. His Instagram page, which is still up as we just found out, shows him hiking, camping, and diving. At one point, he was even bitten by a rattlesnake. Hashtag Satan, hashtag Devil's Avatar, hashtag Apocalypse. According to his father, Patrick, John believed it was his life's mission to bring the word of Jesus to the most remote peoples of the world. North Sentinel Island was the epitome of such a place.
Now, we have to take a look at the historical magnitude of missionary work, as well as its contemporary manifestations. In short, Christian proselytizing is deeply intertwined with European colonial expansion. Settlers in the so-called New World were almost exclusively Christians, and many sought to convert the indigenous populations and enslaved African peoples to their faith.
Christianity was often employed as a justification for violent colonialism. Many Americans have heard the term manifest destiny, the belief that Christian expansion across the United States was not only a right but an obligation. Other settlers, like the Boers in present-day South Africa, also had religious impetuses for their land theft. They were ardent Calvinists, believing that the territory was theirs to rule, and the indigenous Africans who did not follow Christianity were backward heathens who were inherently beneath them.
Throughout this imperial history, missionaries have often claimed that their work is civilizing. They save people. They bring the barbaric pagans out of the darkness and into the light. The racist allegories here are obvious, as is the paternalistic view that colonialism somehow benefits the colonized. If you've not yet read The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, I'd really recommend it. It's a post-colonial novel about this Baptist family that moves to the Belgian Congo turned DRC to convert the locals. And the hubris of the main character over his own religion versus the Congolese villagers is really astounding, but accurate to how some of these missionaries see themselves. There's a central conflict in the story where the preacher wants to baptize all the Congolese children in the river, and the Congolese people are like, you can't wade into the water, there's crocodiles in there. And he ignores their very practical point because he sees his faith as metaphorical practices superior to the literal safety of the Congolese villagers he claims to want to save. This brings us to a central issue of missionary colonialism. What the settlers really brought to these previously autonomous places were diseases for which the indigenous people hadn't developed any natural immunity. Illnesses like smallpox, measles, and the flu killed around 90% of America's indigenous peoples. To be clear, European settlers committed many, many massacres against the indigenous people in what amounts, in my mind, to a clear genocide. We don't want to imply that the decimation of native communities was any kind of accident. But spreading your germs to previously isolated people is epidemiologically reckless. Perhaps the settlers hundreds of years ago didn't realize this, although I have a hard time believing that they could watch millions of indigenous people die from smallpox and not consider that maybe they had something to do with it.
Actually, they were definitely aware of this. If we see the siege of Fort Pitt in modern day Pittsburgh in 1763, basically the British at the time were at war with the loose confederation of indigenous tribe out of the Ohio country in Pontiac's rebellion. And the summer of 1763, the tribal confederation had besieged the British garrison at Fort Pitt. Earlier that year, in the spring, a smallpox outbreak had occurred, and the Brits had built an infirmary in the fort. You fast forward to the summer of 1763 in the siege, a couple of tribal chiefs approached the fort to negotiate the surrender of the garrison. The Brits refused to surrender, but offered the chiefs gifts as a sign of friendship. Included in these gifts were 2 blankets and a handkerchief taken from the infirmary at the fort. Now, the Brits at the time were certainly not aware of germ theory, though Arab and Indian physicians had posited pathogens as a cause of disease as early as the 11th century, but they did seem dimly aware that cloth that came into contact with the rash caused by the smallpox virus would cause a disease to spread. That gift exchange caused a relatively minor smallpox epidemic, and I say relatively minor only in terms of numbers relative to other epidemics at the time, to break out among the Confederation, killing over 100 individuals in a few months. It's one of the early forms of biological warfare that we know about for a fact. And I just want to quote an exchange by letters between 2 British officers, one of which was in charge of Fort Pitt. Colonel Henry Bouquet at Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was preparing an expedition to relieve Fort Pitt when General Amherst wrote to him on June 29, 1763, quote, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes of the Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." End quote. Bouquet responded to Amherst, quote, "P.S. I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. As it is pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and hunt them with English dogs, supported by rangers and some light horse who would, I think, effectively exterminate or remove that vermin." End quote. Amherst replied to Bouquet, quote, "P.S. You will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that at present." End quote.
That is horrific. That's
Yeah,
so horrific.
that is biological warfare, like just pure biological warfare. And not only that, but genocidal biological warfare at that.
Completely. There's no question. But I think we can agree contemporary medicine does have a better grasp of the spread of infectious diseases. People like Allen Chau, who deliberately sought out the world's most isolated society, would know that interacting with remote people could literally kill them all. And this, I think, shows his supreme arrogance. John Chau decided for the Sentinelese, who have demonstrated time and time again that they do not wish to be contacted, that he was going to risk their lives to indoctrinate them into his religion. And John clearly understood this risk because he self-quarantined for 11 days before trying to reach the island. Quarantining is a hot topic right now due to the coronavirus epidemic, so let's explain how it works and how it doesn't work. Basically, a quarantine is when an individual isolates themselves from other people to avoid spreading communicable infections. The word quarantine literally comes from the Venetian word for 40 days, because that's how long shipping crews had to be isolated to prevent them from spreading the plague.
If you believe you've come into contact with someone who might carry an infection, self-quarantine reduces the risk of you passing that infection onto someone else, even if you personally don't show any symptoms of illness. For instance, if one of your coworkers is diagnosed with the flu, and especially if you haven't been vaccinated, you should isolate yourself from other people to avoid passing it on to them, chiefly elderly people and the infants who are most at risk from dying if they contract the virus.
Quarantine periods vary based on how long the infection takes to incubate or show physical symptoms. For COVID-19, this is thought to be around 2 weeks, although medical knowledge of the virus is still developing. For many infectious diseases, incubation is longer than 11 days, and we're just going to go through a couple. Tuberculosis, which is one of the deadliest communicable diseases worldwide, has an incubation period of between 2 and 10 weeks. Chickenpox, or shingles, is up to 21 days. Pertussis, or whooping cough, is up to 21 days. Measles is up to 18 days, and walking pneumonia is up to 2 weeks.
On quarantines and COVID-19, just a few notes. We just found out through some studies that COVID-19 does not transmit from mother to newborn prenatally, which is great. But quarantining is especially important even if people don't experience severe symptoms, because unlike other organisms, viruses need hosts to replicate. In this case, it's us. And healthy young adults may experience COVID-19 as a mild cold, but it doesn't mean that the virus isn't using your body as a clone factory and then going out and infecting less fortunate individuals who could, for a variety of reasons, die if they were infected.
Right. Stay home, people. Stay home. And all of the diseases we mentioned above and many more could kill all or most of the Sentinelese people if they were exposed. Moreover, John Chau didn't go directly from his self-quarantine to North Sentinel Island. He paid Indian fishermen relatively large sums of money for them to illegally ferry him to the island. So in that time, he would have been exposed to any infections they might unknowingly carry and transfer to these poor Senegalese people. Sorry, Sentinelese, not Senegalese. Oh my gosh. And John's self-imposed isolation wasn't simply due to concern for the health of the Sentinelese. Obviously, if he cared about their well-being, he wouldn't expose them to his germs in the first place. He admits in his diary and letters that he spent these 11 days basically hiding out from the Indian authorities, since he had plans to break the law by visiting North Sentinel Island.
Well, John entered the country, India, fraudulently on a tourist visa and didn't want to draw attention to himself as a missionary because he knew that if the Indian government learned of his plans, they would stop him for his own safety and the safety of the Sentinelese.
Some sources will tell you that before John Chau, nobody ever contacted the Sentinelese, but that isn't entirely true. The island has definitely been isolated from its surroundings for the better part of thousands of years. But at one point during the late 19th century, British colonialists invaded the island and kidnapped 2 elderly people and 4 children for some sort of bizarre experimental purposes. They were probably going to measure their skulls or something. I don't really know.
Now that you mention it, I wonder what the average Sentinelese skull circumference and brow ridge angle is. Just saying, like their haplogroup would be quite unique given their isolation from other haplogroups.
Yeah, I mean, predictably, the elderly people immediately got sick and died. So the Brits were like, oh, shit. And then they returned the children to the island. But it's impossible to say whether these children had already been infected with communicable diseases and spread these illnesses to the unimmune Sentinelese. But based on how the Sentinelese have reacted to pretty much every incursion since, I think it's pretty safe to say the outcome was not good. Every time outsiders have purposefully or accidentally gotten too close to North Sentinel Island, the indigenous people have been very hostile. They have launched spears and arrows at anthropologists who tried to approach the island, and have tried to attack sailors who shipwrecked on the coral reef near the beach. As a result, the Indian government has declared the area a tribal reserve and banned anyone from traveling within 3 miles of the island or taking photographs of the Sentinelese.
After the 2004 tsunami, which devastated areas around the Bay of Bengal, the Indian government dispatched a helicopter to check on the Sentinelese and make sure they were still kicking. The Sentinelese attacked the helicopter with spears and arrows, so it's safe to say they survived and did a lot more than just kick, and they still don't want anyone else to contact them. In 2006, two Indian fishermen who were poaching near the island lost control of their boat and drifted ashore. The Sentinelese attacked them with axes and then buried their bodies in the sand. When the Indian government tried to retrieve their bodies, they were also threatened by the islanders, so they left their remains alone.
Because of this, we know very little about the Sentinelese people. We don't even know what they call themselves. It's probably not Senegalese, though. And we don't have any insight into their cultural practices or belief systems. John Chau chauvinistically referred to the island as, quote, Satan's last stronghold, end quote. But how would he have any idea what the Sentinelese are up to? Who is to say that our concept of civilization is any more moral or developed than theirs? The Sentinelese must be aware that outsiders exist because they've seen other people, and they must also be aware that those other people possess different technology to themselves because they've seen that too. But let's take a second to look at things from their perspective. None of these outsiders have ever successfully invaded their island. Like, India literally has nuclear weapons, but the Sentinelese don't know that. For their intents and purposes, they have an extremely effective military that has been able to fight off motorboats and helicopters.
And despite the power they might feel from fending off these attempted encroachments, the Sentinelese have never tried to exercise that power by invading or conquering the territories of other people. They quite clearly just want to be left alone. They have never ever exercised violence against an outsider who hasn't breached their island first. Their actions has been completely defensive. They aren't really harming anyone.
Right? And think about how the Brits weren't successfully invaded since 1066 and how cocky they got.
Oh, Christ, yeah.
So, why was John Chau so determined to bother the Sentinelese? John was affiliated with a group called All Nations, which Alex Perry characterizes as, quote, a missionary group specializing in converting remote tribes, end quote. The more isolated and the farther from the grasp of Christian expansionism, the better. After John's death, Dr. Mary Ho, the institution's leader, would unapologetically write, quote, throughout church history, the privilege of sharing the gospel has often involved great cost. We pray that John's sacrificial efforts will bear eternal fruit in due season, end quote. From Perry's article and a profile by J. Oliver Conroy of The Guardian, it seems as though John Allen Chau had a savior complex of his own that was perhaps abetted by his involvement in organizations like All Nations. In John's final letter to his family, written the day before his death, he explains,
You guys might think I'm crazy in all of this, but I think it's worth it to declare Jesus to these people. Please not be angry at them or God if I get killed. Rather, please live your lives in obedience to whatever He, capital H by the way, has called you to, and I will see you again when you pass through the veil. Don't retrieve my body. This is not a pointless thing. The eternal lives of this tribe is at hand, and I can't wait to see them around the throne of God, worshipping in their own language, as Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 and 10 states.
John had been warned many times that visiting North Sentinel Island was a suicide mission. On both his first and second visits, the Sentinelese made their desire to be left alone very clear, threatening John with bows and arrows. One of these even pierced John's Bible.
I mean, this idiot probably saw that as a divine sign, as if God, the supreme creator of being, is sat on his throne, playing Sims with us, and basically made it such that the Bible will protect him from this arrow.
Right, I'm sure he looked at it as a sign.
An omen, if you will.
Right. John had traveled all over the world and consorted with other like-minded missionaries. He may have been stuck in a theological echo chamber, but he certainly wasn't naive. He was aware of the possible consequences of this trip, from legal repercussions with the Indian government to death by the Sentinelese. The problem is that his self-righteous and single-minded worldview prevented him from caring.
Despite their repeated attempts to chase him away, John continued to approach the Sentinelese. On November 17, 2018, he convinced some Indian fishermen, who Perry claims were Christians themselves, but most likely swayed by Chau's bribery and their own faiths, to drop him off near the island once more and pick him up in the evening. But when the fishermen returned, John Allen Chau wasn't waiting for them. This time, the Sentinelese has fought him off with deadly force. John's body, riddled with arrows, was buried near the shore.
John's family knew of his plans and the extreme danger they posed to him, and it wasn't until long after his death that John's mother, Linda, contacted the United States consulate in India and asked that they check on his well-being. The US and Indian authorities were able to piece together the story rather quickly and ascertain that John's body was still on North Sentinel Island. The fishermen Chau had bribed to take him to the island have been apprehended. According to reporting in the New York Times, 7 people were arrested and charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder and violating rules protecting Aboriginal tribes. Section 299 of the Indian Penal Code states that the culpable homicide charge carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. I could only find news that the fishermen had made bail, but no other updates on the criminal case against them since then. However, it sounds like the Indian government will not go easy on them. It wants to set an example to avoid a recurrence of this in the future and to show parties like the United States that it's taking this case very seriously. But to be honest, I feel conflicted about this. On the one hand, the fishermen knew that they were breaking the law and that John was in grave danger. But on the other hand, he bribed them with a significant amount of money, and it sounds like they acted out of poverty, whereas he acted out of ideological determination. When someone dies like this, the state usually wants its pound of flesh. I just don't know if the local fishermen should be the ones to give it.
India did make attempts to retrieve John's body, but quickly realized that doing so would endanger the lives of rescue crews and the Sentinelese, and decided that the safest option for everyone was to leave John on North Sentinel Island, where he has been buried.
The United States government has declined to prosecute the Sentinelese, but no shit. What are they going to do? Send a subpoena to North Sentinel Island? Good luck with that. We don't know whether John's brief contact while he was alive, or his body on the island spread any pathogens to the Sentinelese. It's certainly possible that his voyage was deadly for some of the islanders as well. As recently as the 1980s, contact with previously isolated groups like the Nahua in Peru has resulted in half of them dying from infectious diseases, like the common cold. It is real and a devastating consequence of invading remote enclaves. This leads us to the ongoing struggle for tribal sovereignty and indigenous rights, including the right not to be contacted. The organization Survival International advocates against forcing contact with peoples who demonstrate that they do not wish to merge. Its website states, "Whole populations of uncontacted tribes are being wiped out by genocidal violence from outsiders who steal their land and resources, and by diseases like the flu and measles to which they have no resistance."
John Allen Chau is by far not the first missionary to be killed by indigenous peoples who felt threatened by his presence. In 1867, Australian Methodist missionary Thomas Baker was killed and eaten by a Fijian tribe. The villagers still proudly display the rock they used to kill Baker.
That's hilarious.
They probably had his liver with a side of fava beans and a nice Chianti. Missionaries yeah, missionaries James Chalmers and Oliver Fellows Tompkins were also allegedly killed and cannibalized by indigenous people in New Guinea in 1901. Of course, stories of cannibalism, especially involving encounters between the civilized Westerner and barbaric native, are often sensationalized, as there's actually zero evidence that the Sentinelese have ever engaged in cannibalism.
Perhaps your religion brings you joy, peace, and security. Perhaps you think it's the most beautiful thing in the world and you want to share it with everyone. I understand that, really. Feeling like you have this great thing and you want everyone to be part of it. But have some empathy and think of how you'd feel if someone else invaded your sacred space to try and convert you to their belief system. What if they risked your health and safety to do that? John Chau risked the lives of the Sentinelese and violated their right to remain uncontacted when he repeatedly breached their island. It is sad that he died, but this tragedy was a totally preventable one. Standing with indigenous peoples means respecting their sovereignty over their own lands and not forcing them to assimilate to a system that you believe is superior to their own.
Speaking of the converting the non-believers and the heathens, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please reach out to your friends and let them know. We hope to be producing content during the social distancing period for you to safely enjoy in the comfort of your own home. There are a few other ways you can support us. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app, We hope to be syndicated on as many platforms as possible, though since this is our first episode, that might take just a little bit of time. Regardless, we intend to release weekly episodes on Mondays.
Or you could become a patron on Patreon at www.patreon.com/dascriminal. You can get all sorts of benefits like a shout out on the show, access to exclusive Patreon polls and fan requests, monthly bonus content, including full-length episodes, casual chat episodes, and written editorials from Almer. And you'll, of course, get the warm, fuzzy feeling you get knowing that you're helping to support the show. So right now, as this episode will be published, we're about to record a full-length episode just for Patreon on the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and a casual chat show about what we're up to during the quarantine. So hit us up over there if you want to keep listening. And we also want you to give us feedback there and let us know how you want us to improve the show. So what kind of episodes do you want to see in the future? As we work toward creating more content, would you prefer longer episodes or more releases? Would you be interested in things like merch or meetups? We want this to be really collaborative with all of you. And for every $250 increase we see in our Patreon contributions, we'll release an extra bonus episode to all patrons regardless of contribution amount.
Sorry, I was just drinking some wine. Please follow our socials at Das Criminal Pod. That is DASCRIMINAL Pod. We share images related to shows, news, and memes. Rate us 5 stars and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or other apps that allow you to recommend us.
Yeah, so thanks so much for listening. We hope we've been entertaining during this little downtime. Next week, do we want to say what we're doing next week?
No, we should leave it as a surprise. I'm really excited, though. I'm really excited.
So next week, Monday, another episode. It's a surprise. And this is normally where our Patreon shoutouts would go, but since this is our first episode, I just want to thank a couple people, and Amr might. I just want to thank my family and friends, especially my mom and dad, who support me. Even when I tell them I'm doing a murder podcast, they're like, okay, sweetie, sounds great. And also Dearmid, who has given me advice and patiently listened to me ramble about this podcast for weeks on end.
Oh, that's so nice. That's sweet. That's adorable. But honestly, I want to thank you for putting so much work and effort into this podcast. To be honest, Erin has pretty much done 85% of the work. I just sort of show up and ramble, which goes to show how women hold up not just half the sky, but pretty much 95% of the sky.
Thanks. Also, I have a gig-related job, so the COVID-19 virus has hit me pretty hard, which means I have time to sit at home and read and research for this, but also that this is the fruit of my labor for right now.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you guys for listening, and we hope to hit you back next week with a very fun new episode.
Bye.
Bye.